My name is Nader Tehrani, and I'm honored to host you here tonight as the Dean of the Irwin S. Chanin School of Architecture of the Cooper Union. As with all other current work lectures, this event is co-hosted by the Architectural League of New York, with Billy Tien as the president of its board of directors, Rosalie Ginevro as executive director, and Anne Rieselbach as program director. This program is supported in part by public funds from the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs in partnership with the City Council and the New York State Council of the Arts, with the support of Governor Andrew Cuomo and the New York State Legislature. Tonight, it is with great pleasure that I welcome Deborah Berke to Cooper Union. A bit over a year ago, Deborah took on the deanship at the Yale School of Architecture, where she's been teaching since 1987. A graduate of the Rhode Island School of Design, Deborah emerged during the days of the Talking Heads in a place where the interdisciplinary exchange between the arts was, and remains to this day, part and parcel of its architectural program. Energized by voices such as Judith Wolin, who's here with us tonight, an emerging young voice of the era with intellectual links to Colin Rowe and James Sterling, Deborah was already saturated with academic ambitions at a very early age. Her move back to New York took her to the Institute of Architecture and Urban Studies, where she ran the education program in the context of a generation of critical voices, all of whom were operating within the margins and trying to reconstitute architectural discourse beyond practice as an intellectual and speculative endeavor. If you would like to see the youthful faces of Anthony Vidler, Kenneth Frampton, and Peter Eisman, I invite you all back to Cooper Union's Rose Auditorium this Thursday night, when we will be featuring Diana Agres's film, The Making of an Avant-Garde, within which Deborah is featured for a second time in 1 week. I look forward to that. Beyond the stellar intellectual footprints she left behind at RISD, where I also spent my undergraduate years, I rediscovered Deborah some years later through her book, Architecture of the Everyday, a book that attempted to overcome the extravagance and the hysteria of design in the 1990s with an appeal to the banal, the generic, and the ordinary, effectively to mine out of the quotidian something that transcends the terms of the very conditions out of which architectural form is born. It is with this lens that I viewed some of the ongoing work in preparation for this occasion, and I found many things, but banal was not one of them. With a track record of challenging negotiations with historic architects, most recently with H.H. Richardson and I.M. Pei, Deborah Berke has had to internalize a variety of languages, each with their own syntax, if only to reimagine a bold way of engaging questions of preservation, renovation, and intervention as discrete and differentiated conceptual paradigms. Indeed, she's sometimes had to wear 3 hats on one project, demonstrating her protean intellectual malleability that is part of dealing with historic matter. For the Rockefeller Arts Center in Fredonia, Deborah deviously extends the base of the I.M. Pei building to form a platform from which her own intervention may rise. In turn, from the mass of board-formed concrete that is the signature of Pei, Berke's addition inverts its tectonic logic, adopting razor-like fins to create a trabeated system whose elongated elegance forms an almost Gothic levity in contrast to Pei's grounded density. The Cummins Indy Distribution Headquarters in Indianapolis, that we'll see tonight, I think, adopts a similar refinement. At first, what seems like a generic office slab, modern in its articulation of the structural grid, is anything but. The grid is merely a foil for operations that expand and contract. They bend and they heave, and effectively draw out a sensuous figure from what would otherwise remain a respectable yet generic warp and weft of the curtain wall configuration. In the hands of Deborah Berke, the everyday is not just another day. It is already transformed, edited and honed to a particular ethic, and lacking a better vocabulary for it, I simply attribute it to the masterful skill of judgment and design in conversation. Before I welcome our guests to the podium, let me just add that I doubt I would be standing up here were it not for Deborah herself. Indeed, as I nervously showed up for an interview at Cooper some 3 years ago, I was pleasantly surprised to see her there as part of the committee. I did not know her at the time, but her deliberate questions and careful guidance thereafter was a central part of my decision to join this community. What is maybe even more poignant, though, is that when Deborah was appointed dean at Yale, she reached out to me yet again, this time asking for words of wisdom, me as a dean, as if my 1 year of honeymoon at Cooper would constitute the necessary weight of experience. I was, of course, very touched and more than anything humbled. She'd reached out for advice, but instead imparted a critical lesson about academic generosity. Please join me in welcoming Deborah to the podium.
Thank you very much. That was awfully nice. So it's also nice to be in this spectacular and historic room, but I'm nervous, and I think it's actually hard to talk about architecture, or hard for me. A lecture is linear with a beginning and an end, but architecture is simultaneously so many things and is so often assumed to be about even more things like development or construction. Or money. I mean, it's always about money. Testing ideas and options and weighing them against cost and time and cost one more time. It can be about materials or detailing and pattern and color. That's certainly some of the fun part. And it can be about history and drawing and precedent and creating the new. That's really the fun part. We talk about architecture a lot in terms of experience. I think this approach is clearest in its dramatic moments, but it's all about the way a person moves past a building or through the space of a building, inhabits it, and uses it as part of their day-to-day life. So how to do this? Happily, the Architectural League provides some direction on how to speak about architecture, at least for this lecture. They told me to speak about no more than 4 projects and to speak about them in depth and detail, so I followed their instructions. First, I'm going to speak about a building Nader mentioned that we recently completed in Indianapolis. A headquarters for the distribution division of Cummins Inc., a Fortune 500 company that employs over 54,000 people around the world and is based rather famously in Columbus, Indiana. The building is a simple bar of offices that does a lot of things. Backstory. Cummins bought a city block in downtown Indianapolis. It's where one half of the Market Square Arena was. The arena had spanned the street, so actually stood on 2 blocks and was an urban dam in a bad way. Torn down in 1999, by 2000, our half of it was a 4-acre parking lot. The arena had actually been most famous for being the last place Elvis performed in 1977, so it was a long downhill slide. Not for Elvis, for the arena. The site was on Market Street, 3 blocks from the center of the city, Monument Circle, and we sought in our project to reinforce the street wall along Market Street, which was an important urban axis in need of some reinforcement. And although they had an entire city block, we proposed a very slender 9-story building at the north edge of the site to add density and help regenerate an active street corridor. So the following few slides will show a bit of the early thought process. We wanted to allow for additional development in the future. We looked at where the lobby might best go and where the required parking would need to go and where the retail would best be. and where the company-wide training center made the most sense, and where the offices should be, which we already had predetermined. We located the best position facing south for the public park and the green space. Now, what happened was this was round one of study. It was close to being right, but it was too expensive and too expansive. So we moved to consolidate and tested putting parking, for instance, between the lobby and the office floors, but hated what that would do to the street frontage of the building on Market Street. The design of the base and of the parking changed, but it remained clear from the get-go that the office building itself should be tall and shallow in depth. So looking at it from the Market Street side, this sketch shows the form of the building as it started to develop. And looking at it from the east, back toward Monument Circle, and you can see the monument, we were also testing what the Market Street facade would be like with ground floor retail. This sketch shows an elaborate stepped urban outdoor room, and at the left, our attempt to make a sheltered entrance for the building. Both the green space and the setback idea of entrance address the city's cultural trail, which is at the foreground of this drawing. But in this version, both were too elaborate, not the cultural trail. However, the idea that a mid-sized building could have an outsized urban presence was not. That was a good idea, and it remained our goal. And from those early sketches, this is what became the final site plan, with a long base, a thin building, a parking garage, and a public park and open space. This is a short clip from a video that Cummins produced to give their employees a preview of the building as they were in rented space in Indianapolis or an hour south in Columbus. And as I've said, the siting strategy created very narrow floor plates, which allowed the interior of the building to be entirely daylit and for everyone inside to have views of the city and the park. But it also gets a lot of sun. That could be terrible, both experientially and in terms of performance. Poorly designed all-glass buildings can be uncomfortable and inefficient. So working with Atelier 10, we did extensive light and energy modeling to ensure that the building would be high performance and comfortable for its users. We used daylighting models and studied heat gain from solar radiation and did an overshadowing analysis from neighboring buildings to further tune the size and spacing of the shading elements, the types of glass we used, and the location of the opaque panels. It's a highly calibrated facade. This drawing shows the horizontal sunshades. And here you can see them, the passive shading elements, horizontal shades and vertical fins that vary in depth depending on location, as well as the opaque panels that help increase insulation at the envelope and provide places for solid walls and privacy within. This is the mock-up of the facade panel in the expansive parking lot, designed to be lifted and rotated so that we could quickly study the choices of each orientation in relation to the sun. We worked in a design assist process on this, detailing directly through shop drawings and mock-ups. When I spoke about money at the beginning, I probably should have shown a project schedule rather than a bunch of study models, because as everyone knows, time is money. Cummins had a very, very tight schedule for the project. This photograph was taken 18 months after the first day we picked up a pencil on the job. It was a true fast-track project. We worked closely with a very large team, including Ratio Architects of Indianapolis. We listened, collaborated, and learned new skills, particularly management ones, as we saw how Cummins actually ran their team. Note all the ways into the building and the project, into the lobby from the street and from the park, into the stores on Market Street, into the restaurant from the park, into the loading dock from New Jersey Street, and into the park from New Jersey Street, as well as into the garage, and the many ways actually into the park itself. One of the ways in is the approach into the building is the approach through the new park, which was designed by David Rubin of Land Collective out of Philadelphia. The park is beginning to take hold and should be much more fully grown this coming spring. Here are two bikers this summer on the cultural trail, moving through the city and passing the new park. I like how he's checking it out with his quick leftward. You have to trust me that it's quick, it's frozen here. How he's checking it out with his quick leftward glance. The parking structure connects to the office building and is another one of the ways in. The graphics are by the Doyle Partnership, and the text reads, "I am Cummins, you can depend on me." The entrance along Market Street coming from the west, as you saw in the little film clip, and actually looking at the entrance itself with its 1962 Paul Rand designed logo, which Cummins still uses. And then on into the light-filled lobby. Cummins has been for decades a patron of art and design, as you can see here. I hope the sculpture on the ceiling is by an artist named Kendall Buster. On the second floor, the access from parking meets those coming up from the lobby. You can see a staircase and the bridge from the parking at the top of the stairs. So everyone effectively arrives at the same place, and it's the place where they serve coffee. So dining, snack bar, work booths, learning center, meeting rooms, and classrooms fill this entire floor. Here's the outdoor terrace, which is meant for picnics, but this is it in the January snow, and the stair up from the lobby, and the view from the top of the stairs at the initial lounge area. This is the fourth floor plan, so we're a little further up in the building now. And pairs of floors within the building are connected by double height social hubs. This is the one between 3 and 4. They're meant to be casual gathering places for individual and collaborative work. This is the 6th floor plan with what we call the pretzel stair. And this is its elevator lobby with clear, sort of heads-up kind of signage. The social hubs, in addition to being workspaces, offer views out to the park and to the city beyond. And a site-specific mural by the artist Odili Donald Odita unifies the social hubs. And you see the mural from many different vantage points. It's art as part of the workplace, elevating everyday work life. Here's that pretzel stair again. In our design, we like to imagine that the stairs promote both active workspace and create places for casual encounters. This is the 8th floor plan. Its staircase doubles as a bleacher seating, here viewed from the typical day-lit offices in which there are no assigned desks. This picture is so early on that there are actually very few workers moved into the building, but the building's designed to seat 400 people. Cummins had come to us with a workplace utilization multiplier, sounds like industrial America, doesn't it, of 1.75. So with hot desking, the building can actually accommodate 700 employees. And looking at that stair again, you can also once again see this mural, which is even more clearly explained in this section. The mural's called The Wisdom of Trees, and it was inspired by Odili's visit to the Miller House in Columbus and his experience of the Dan Kiley landscape there. Here's the mural on 5 and 6. And looked at closely from on floor 5. and visible in its entirety from the exterior of the building at night. So it becomes a piece of corporate art as public art at the same time. And it reflects in that way Cummins' values as a company and adds, from our perspective, to the identity of the building. I think that designing for the complexities of the contemporary experience requires engaging the role that architecture can play both as a process and as a continuous work in progress, and seeing where it can actually lead over time. And I guess I'm charmed to show you this picture in part because, as an aside, it ended up being not so very different in its presence as you look from Monument Circle from that very early end-on view sketch. So I'm often asked about our architectural approach in terms of minimalism. And while that's certainly an influence, our work is more often driven by geometric purity, and we tend to prefer visual simplicity over something very busy. It's not the whole story, because one of my favorite joys in architecture is to make a complex programmatic need with tons going on behind the walls and under the floorboards look utterly natural and effortless. Maybe that's actually what minimalism is. Because often with our most plain-spoken works, we're dealing with tricky constraints, whether that's the plot size, shape, or topography, geographic location, or absurd zoning requirements, or the need for truly flexible space. So it can be by using the simplest envelope possible. We enjoy playing around with the fact that a building doesn't have to wear its complexity on its face. In fact, a fairly complicated structure can appear simple and straightforward. This approach can elevate big buildings and enhance modest houses. And it can make the mundane, if not the banal, at least the mundane, Nader, such as this branch bank in Columbus, Indiana, become a celebrated local icon and still function as a heavily used, convenient bank. Now, whether in Indiana or elsewhere, local culture is always important, including places like Western upstate New York. In Fredonia, New York, the architects Harry Cobb, James Freed, and I.M. Pei used modernist planning and a distinctive design language to create a remarkable and austere campus for the State University of New York. A ring road defined the pure plan for the campus, which you can see here. And at the Red Square is a building called the Rockefeller Arts Center, but you can also see somewhat the destruction of the diagram. Its front originally addressed the loop off the ring, and its back, including the loading dock, faced in the other direction. Unfortunately, this eventually became the center of the campus, with a large parking lot, new buildings, and the point of arrival for visitors, so that they entered through a severe blank wall through the loading dock. In addition to the master plan, the three architects designed a number of monumental board-form concrete buildings that define the campus, including the Rockefeller Arts Center, which is at the bottom right, completed in 1968 and shown to you in the master plan, location in the master plan a minute ago. The campus work is very much beautiful to my eye, particularly when it's not freezing cold outside, which it is often in this location. And so I show you again the site plan of the Rockefeller Arts Center today, with the back of the building now the front, and our 60,000 square foot addition shown in red. It added, among other things, a new front door, giving the building a front at the point of arrival, where that parking lot and other new buildings have been added. We did more than a dozen massing studies to consider how the new building should relate to the existing. And we punched through Pei's concrete wall in two key places. That was one of the biggest challenges, locating all the different points of access and connection for theater goers, students, faculty, raw materials, stage sets, musical instruments, and the like, all on one facade. This is the first floor plan. We put a long hallway, can't do that, you can see it running up and down. I forgot the little thingy. And you can see how very long and very blank that wall was. We wanted its original exposed concrete to be present in the new building, which you'll see in a minute. Along that hall is access to the original theaters and to the classrooms and studios, and at the bottom of the plan you see a little connector to the nearby music building. On the second floor, in addition to new space, we renovated a wing of the original building to create new classrooms and studios for illustration, media, and theater. We explored Pei's design language and thought about how a new edition could extend that language into the 21st century. Because the material palette was so strong and so limited on the campus, we thought about how we could use it in new ways, and here you actually see that original long blank wall and where people went in. We developed a distinctive diagonal board form to differentiate our work, as Nader had mentioned, from the work of our predecessors, and learned early in the project that the legacy of the construction of the 1968 campus was a local expertise in architectural concrete that we took advantage of for our addition. The play of light and shadow and the color of the concrete is quite beautiful, as you can see. It's not ondo pristine. It's rugged and textured, but very sensual at the same time, I think. And just as we did at Cummins, we thought a lot about light breaking across surfaces and how to calibrate not only the texture of the concrete, but also the relationship of metal and glass. We inverted Pei's material palette and didn't do monumental concrete with glass and metal infill. Instead, we used zinc as the primary facade element for a different strategy about glazed surfaces and created specific appointments of poured-in-place concrete in certain locations that we made clearly new by that angled pattern. Here it is on the outdoor ceramics workspace. You can see the transition between the old and the new, and our connection to the music building that I mentioned when we were looking at the first floor plan, so that the large and valuable musical instruments no longer had to be loaded into a van in the snowstorm to be driven to the theaters that were less than 100 feet away. Here's another image showing our work in relationship to Pei's. From far away and straight on, you can see the materials and the extension of the horizontal lines and the rhythm of the fenestration and how the two buildings are connected from compositional strategy. But as you see it from an angle, you catch more complex three-dimensional relationships, both between the two buildings and within ours itself. We gave the facade depth to decrease solar gain and to provide the building texture and rhythm in contrast to the smooth monumentality of the existing 1960s vertical surfaces that you can see on the left in this picture. I think one of the frequent realities of solid monolithic buildings, as much as I often love them, is that you don't know what's going on inside of them. So our building allows students and the public to see the activities going on inside the building. And we brought activities like the work yard to the outside, out to the sidewalk, so you could connect with those activities as well. And we made pieces of the massive building actually transparent, giving one the opportunity of seeing, for instance, the piano silhouetted in the slightly cantilevered dance studio on the second floor. This is the entrance from the parking lot. It has a protected roof area at the door, and a cafe within for students and the public, and you can see the concrete carried in from the outside to the interior. And from the inside, you get beautiful views back out to the campus. The building has become, happy to report, a hive of activity at all hours and every day. It's designed for really heavy use, for yoga, upward-facing dog. We love the directness of art-making spaces. I went to art school, as Nader said, so making things has always been important to me, and we've designed many visual and performing art spaces over the years with a kind of enthusiasm for the activity. This is the sculpture studio, and this is the sculpture and welding foundry. And this is the new ceramic studio. At the connection between the old building and the new, we kept the markings from years of use and their theater tradition, as you can see on the left side of the right image. And as I mentioned before, we not only brought our concrete into the building interior, but used, as its mate from 50 years ago, the Pei exterior concrete wall as an intentional part of our interior as well. This section shows the new addition at the left, the new dance studio above, and the floor level relationship to the original building on the right. The big daylit dance studio is a space for practice and for instruction, and can also be a space for public performances. Its materials are basic and inexpensive, except for the sprung floor part of it, of course. But the light and proportions make it a stunning space to work in, and I do believe that space for work should be beautiful. With open and lit spaces like that, the building has become a marker of all the performance study and culture on campus for the students and for the broader community in this part of way western upstate New York. So, as Nader said, and as that project alluded to, one of the things about our practice is that we work with a lot of old buildings to transform them for contemporary life. Some are, like the last example, a new building attached to one that was only 50 years older. But most involve working with a lot of mostly dead, mostly white men, including some pretty amazing architects of the past, like Albert Kahn, Louis Kahn, H.H. Richardson, Shreve Lamb Harmon, and McKim, Mead and White. One of those men is C.B.J. Snyder, who is maybe less famous, but arguably just as important, certainly to New Yorkers. Snyder was the superintendent of school buildings in New York City from 1891 to 1923, a progressive era of sorts. And his office designed over 400 schools across the 5 boroughs, including more than 140 elementary schools. Interestingly enough, since we're in this room, he also studied at the Cooper Union. One of his innovations was to design schools with H-shaped floor plans, which created protected play yards and buildings that were actually suited to mid-block, low-cost, side street sites. This allowed the city to open more schools more quickly in response to the exploding population, many of whom were, and of course still are, in this city, immigrants. We are working on one of his buildings now, the old PS 122 in the East Village, which has a slightly different site condition. Our little school building is on the corner of an avenue and a side street with a small side yard. The 122 Community Arts Center is a public project for a number of nonprofit arts groups and a social service agency. Here's the building as it used to look as a school when the elevated trains still ran on this section of First Avenue. The building was later abandoned by the Board of Education and reoccupied by arts groups, kind of guerrilla style, in the early 1970s. It had many of its historic details, but was in terrible disrepair, and its elaborate cornice had been removed long ago. The building was kind of wonderfully and woefully dilapidated by the time we were hired to re-envision it, although it had beautiful bones, including what you see here, this soaring stairwell, along with handrail brackets. You can probably just see them in the picture because they are at regular height for teachers and tiny little child height down below. So it had details like that one and like this railing, extant, beautiful details, and to the extent that we can, we are returning all of that fabric and keeping it in the project. As I mentioned, the old PS 122, after it was taken over by the arts groups, housed a number of arts and community organizations. The building was and is very tightly programmed, and the renovation had a very, very low budget. So we worked closely with those groups to uncover redundancies and exploit overlaps in programs and find the best possible uses of shared space. Through this process, a simple but bold strategy emerged. By lifting the largest theater to the roof, we could create column-free space that required much less structural reinforcement, which in turn saved a lot of money. So a new circulation spine, horizontal on the ground to get in and then vertical, built in the side yard, accommodates the building's many audiences and constituencies and makes the building accessible and ADA compliant, which is the thing that we were actually hired to do, bring the building up to code. This move also allows more of the building to be used by the various tenant organization, and it even activates the roof. Adding that small addition in the tiny sort of half an H plan that the original building had, our ground floor plan allowed for the creation of an at-grade entrance, an elevator, proper bathrooms, and a plausible 21st century fire stair, unlike the two stairs in the original building. So the program on the ground floor, starting at the left upper corner and moving clockwise, includes the health clinic, the entry lobby, artist studio spaces, the large room shared, and a gallery in the lower left corner. On the second floor, all the similarly sized rooms to the left of the theater are artist studios, and to the right is the Mabu Mines Theater and its related office spaces. The organizations we were working with said, "Don't make it too nice." And they were saying, "Don't erase our history and the interventions over time that make this building so special." The poet Eileen Miles said, "Plenty of people from PS 122 were part of ACT UP, and the place was hard hit. But I think the work made and performed there probably remains in the blood and bones of the building. Art buildings hold ghosts, good ghosts, and we need to keep them to keep building new times." We liked that. The third floor is all studios, part of Painting Space 122, a not-for-profit dedicated to fostering the arts by providing rotating studio space for unknown but promising artists. For that function, the double-loaded corridor of the original school layout works well, as do the large windows that were originally in the classrooms. Putting the Performance Space 122 large theater and the small practice theater on the original top floor allowed us to create for them, as I mentioned before, large, flexible, column-free theater, and provided an opportunity for visitors to pass through all the public spaces of the building on their way to and from the theater. This was important to all the organizations, that the building serve as a way to form unexpected connections. The new fifth floor, where you can see the double height volume of the large theater on the right, has bathrooms for the theater goers and 2 studios and then public access to the roof terrace. This is the double height flexible theater space on the top floor, the one that we raised the roof of the building to create. The theater is very raw space, and we worked to keep the interventions to the building intentionally very visible. That good blood that's in the bones. We built a simple cardboard study model to show the addition here during the day and here at night. We're using a perforated metal scrim that allows light through at night and shimmers in the daytime. That facade has an outdoor skin of perforated stainless steel set off from an inner surface of corrugated metal. During the design process, we used mock-ups to determine the scale and the detail of the perforations of the outer curtain and the color and tone of the inner corrugated surface. We worked with the artist Monica Getz, and she created a site-specific artwork of integrated lighting along the cornice and the entry canopy. The light will subtly pulse or breathe to give the building an unexpected presence at night. I brought in the sound effects on purpose. In place of the missing cornice, we designed a new perforated metal bench that serves as the guardrail around the perimeter of the roof. The idea is that it and the addition have a presence but not too much mass, and that mass actually reflects light on its surface. The project has been popping up a lot on Instagram, and we hear the neighbors and the artists are excited about the return of PS 122 to the community. The place is filled with lore, out there performances, wild after parties, the accumulation of authorized and unauthorized uses over time. In fact, part of the movie Fame was shot in the building in 1979. And after a very long process of design and construction, anyone here ever done a project with the DDC? I am happy to tell you that 122 will open early in January, and I look forward to seeing you all there. So, like at PS 122 and Performance Space 122 and Mabu Mines and 122CC and its community tenants, we love to have engaged collaborators. And it's a special pleasure to work for and with artists. The dialogue is rich and the collaboration is meaningful. And not all artists are traditional fine arts artists either. Our studio for the Elizabeth Aikens Rug Company accounted for the programmatic needs of artisan work and craft. While at the Amagansett Stephen Talkhouse, I proudly call this an example of truly banal work. Our light touch worked perfectly to create a venue that can host international music legends, but it remains unfussy. That's an understatement. The dance floor is sticky with beer. We didn't do that part, but our renovation is relaxed enough that it works. And many years ago, we designed the new home for the Yale School of Art. One part of it involved the radical renovation of a Jewish community center with a facade by Louis Kahn. That building houses today the art school's offices and the studios and classrooms for the departments of photography, graphic design, and undergraduate painting. It also has an experimental theater for the drama school. For the project, we also designed an immediately adjacent building for graduate painting. The crit space to that building is shown in this photograph. And the idea was to treat art students like working artists with studios, to create working spaces that they could make their own during their time at school. Years later, I met an artist who had studied and worked in one of those spaces, Titus Kafar, a Yale MFA graduate. We met at one of the 21C Museum hotels that we've been designing in our office for years now. Titus and I had never met at Yale, but I was glad that our paths had crossed. We discovered how our lives overlapped through clients, collectors, institutions, and certain strongly held beliefs. This is the 21C Museum Hotel in Louisville, Kentucky, which was the first one we designed a little over 10 years ago. The buildings are 19th century former warehouses into which we cut huge holes and connected separate structures to create guest rooms, a restaurant, a bar, and a variety of museum gallery spaces. This is one of them. And the painting in the above right corner is by Titus. It's part of the show Pop Stars, Popular Culture and Contemporary Art. A lot of Titus's work interrogates the canon of art history, especially as it relates to the representation of African Americans. And these are exquisitely rendered paintings, not collages, all painted. And for Titus, as for us, art is not remote from life. It's an integral part of life. Art literally changed Titus's life, and he's working to use art to change the lives of others. Working with Titus, we're designing a new home for his organization, currently called Elm City PostMasters. Located in the Dixwell neighborhood of New Haven, Elm City PostMasters will provide studio space, gallery and community space, and live workspace for artists, recent graduates from Yale and other art schools, and training and mentorship programs for the students from the James Hill House High School a block away. Elm City PostMasters will occupy 2 abandoned factory buildings, one where medical equipment was made and one where ice cream was made. Remember when we made things? I say that particularly sadly when I read that the place that weaves denim for jeans, the last one in the United States, is closing, but that's parenthetical, sorry. The buildings more recently and sadly have been used for the manufacture of counterfeit goods and even more sadly for prostitution. Here's a plan of Dixwell. It's a medium-density, mostly low-income neighborhood, so close, but in many ways a world away from Yale. We're working on that part. Initially, we thought we would retain the entire complex of buildings, but various existing conditions made that more costly and complicated than it was worth, and we liked the clarity and integrity of keeping the 2 original buildings and not the falling down one at the back, nor the roofed-over driveway in the middle. Through careful planning, we realized that we could subtract some of the existing buildings to create a more functional complex, while retaining and restoring much of the existing fabric. We could add a basement as part of the new building to make the existing basement more expansive. The whole idea of the project is to create working studios and smaller workspaces as well, possibly even for architects and designers, a community space for events, and a gallery, and more studios, and a few live workspaces for resident artists, and a place to party, of course. Because they're artists. Distinct GFRC panels for cladding are an affordable and durable material that set apart the building in the predominantly brick and wood context of the neighborhood. We hope help activate the street. It's going to be a new community hub. We say yay. To walk you quickly through the plans, there will be basement studios and workshops and a small event space directly accessible from outside down a flight of stairs. There are 12 studios on the ground floor, and there is the aula, from a Latin word, a large place where people can congregate, such as a hall, an entry in the center with a gallery beyond it, and cafe to the left. For the resident artists, there are live workspaces on the 2nd floor, and the large residence, or perhaps exhibition space and party deck, is on the top of the new building. There are a lot of new skylights to bring in natural overhead light into the working studios, and there is the large skylight in the location of an original one from the factory in the aula. A section shows the existing building and our new rear addition, a kind of mini tower in this low-rise neighborhood at 3.5 stories. The mix of found and new spaces is much more, we believe, much more interesting and rich than only new or only found would be in a location like this and for a program like this. Construction has started, I'm happy to say. This is a rendering of the exterior, and the building will be ready for working artists and the community in a little less than a year. Titus believes that Elm City PostMasters will be the new neighborhood anchor. So he insisted that the entrance be open and welcoming and not boarded up and chain linked down like many of the buildings in the neighborhood. And from the outside, you'll be able to see into the entry space and in through that to the gallery. The ramp at right leads to the studios, and they're also accessible from a loading dock to the back for material access. That ramp is circulation, but it's also meant to be hangout space. The materials, again, are tough. It's a working art space. This room is the aula. The old factory space that had the skylight in it is becoming the great hall of the building, a co-working space where the community can hold events and classes. We wanted the new building to announce that something special was happening in Dixwell without being fancy, because artists work at all hours and a day-to-night transition happens here. At every step of our collaboration, Titus expressed deep care for his community, and we and he found common ground there. We like to work for local organizations whose missions appeal to us. Often these projects fall far outside the scope of a standard commission architect-client relationship. Whether it's hosting exhibits at our office for artists whose work we find meaningful, or doing pro bono work like the renovation of this test kitchen of the children's food magazine Chop Chop, which was started 5 years ago with the mission to inspire and teach kids to cook real food with their families, to have families eat and cook together as a way to combat obesity throughout the country, help resolve hunger epidemics. We try to be engaged and engaging well beyond the world of design insiders, so the office has run kids' workshops for publications, community organizations, and the Cooper Hewitt. I've actually appeared on podcasts and in Ina Garten's Barefoot Contessa TV show. This was the thing that made me the most famous in the world. People would stop me on the street. It was a sort of eating well and arguing for good design. Who could argue with that? Some of the podcasts have actually even been ostensibly comedic, although that's much more the host than me, because I'm actually a pretty serious person. But I would like for architects and architecture to be less intimidating and to exist in balance and conversation with the forces of life. That perspective also comes comes in handy in my other job. Probably no spoiler alert necessary. Not only did Nader tell you, but you probably already knew. I have a job in New Haven. 1 year, 4 months, 14 days in, not counting. I'm used to ruminating about our discipline and our profession and our work and how we interact with the public in a pedagogical context. And since I've become dean, I've been doing so even more intensely. The position is an opportunity to put my values into a broad range of action. I think these days it's fashionable for architects to respond to pressing social needs, but I don't particularly care about what's fashionable. But I am proud to say that at Yale we've made social engagement a core of architectural education for more than 50 years. And as we work with people like Mayor Harp, a Yale architecture graduate, a nice example of the way we've been trying to broaden the pedagogical approach to architecture. Yale's an elite institution that doesn't have to be elitist in how it functions. Architecture is also often seen as an elite profession. One, that doesn't have to be the case, and two, that shouldn't be how it functions in the world. Architecture can be and must be good as architecture, capital A, but it can also do good, not just be good. Sometimes by program and sometimes by impact, sometimes by presence, sometimes by beauty. In my teaching career, I've especially loved getting to see the emergence of new talent and future collaborators because today's and tomorrow's architects are going to have to engage with the broader architecture of the whole built environment flexibly and creatively. I recently saw a movie, Columbus, that includes scenes beautifully shot at the Irwin Union Bank branch, which we designed in that city. The characters talk compellingly of the power of architecture.
That's when I started coming here. Found it weirdly comforting. In the middle of all the mess, in this fucking strip mall, there was this. Suddenly, the place I'd lived my whole life felt different. Like I'd been transported somewhere else.
It was nice and a little weird to hear them say such lovely things about our work. I had no idea that I was a character in this movie until I saw it. But that was deeply uncomfortable and embarrassing, but I was especially excited to see the union of architectural pedagogy and practice and the power of good building make it to the big screen. I felt that impact myself, and I hope that by working on a broad range of projects and engaging with pedagogy around what it means to design well, that I and we all can improve the world through its built environment. That's through architecture. So thank you.
Your ability to speak with such poise and deliver buildings that, even as you put it, have this ability to conceal all the complexity, produces the illusion that there's absolutely no angst in there. And I know that it's tough to do these buildings, but I want to take you back to a different historic moment. It's a little bit selfish of me, but I think it's important because I have you here and we can look back across a certain passage as a historical moment now. Maybe the passage between RISD and the Institute. And to cite the relevance of that moment in the formation of your thinking today. But also, I think the angst that I inherited in school was the result of that theoretical moment, and I just don't see it in you. So how did you survive that?
Not only are you asking a hard and personal question, but I'm sitting here looking at Mary McLeod, Deanna Agrest, and Judy Wolin, all of whom had huge impacts on that process in my life. So I was at RISD before you, and I was at RISD in the days when creativity was thought to be an idea that brewed in your stomach and landed kerplunk on your drafting table without detouring through the brain. And it was Judy who told me that you actually had to think about what you were doing, not just create from your gut. And when I left RISD, there was a recession, and I had a terrible job, not in an architect's office, but in an engineering firm working as a graphic designer. And I was miserable, so I started going to lectures at the Institute at night. And that gave a richness and intellectual depth to my life at the time, and led me to end up starting with Larry Kutnicki, a graduate of Cooper Union, a high school program there, and eventually replacing Mario Gandelsonis as the person who directed the educational programs. I'm not really answering your question because, in fact, it was slow immersion. I think it was maybe like boiling a lobster, in that I didn't know it was happening. It happened over time. That time.
And what of that era remains today? You're at Yale.
What I learned in that process, in that boil the lobster process, was that you needed an idea. It had to be substantive. You had to believe in it even if nobody else did, and your work had to kind of represent and fight for that idea in its very being. And if the people who were in or around the building experienced it, fantastic, but even if they didn't, it was the fight you had made for your intellectual idea to become a built reality that was the process, the necessary process.
And has that culture been absorbed to become part of the norm today in all of our schools, or
I'm not the one to answer that question, I don't think. I don't know the answer to that question, actually. First of all, I don't think you can speak about all of our schools in one sentence. I think there are many, many, many different ways of teaching architecture, both in different schools and by different people and schools with different history. I do think that in that time period, and very much in part through the influence of the Institute and other sort of historically noted educators of the latter half of the 20th century in North America, theory became part of education, architectural education. But whether everybody somehow absorbed theory and then felt that they had to bring theory to their own work, I don't know.
You were very articulate about what Yale's role has been historically and what you're contributing to that. What new directions are you bringing to Yale that you think diverge from your predecessors? And what role do you think Yale has to play today in the context of other schools? We were on a panel together just a week or two ago. And do you feel a need to polemicize that position?
That's multiple questions in one. I'll do my best to answer them sequentially. It was interesting. I showed pictures of the building project. I think there are a few Yaleys in the room, which has always been kind of notably our socially aware piece of the curriculum. I moved to make it both more aware, in that we're now working with an organization that provides services for the homeless, and also more 21st century, in that we're looking at means of constructions that aren't necessarily stick-built on site. But that's only one piece of the curriculum, and it's, while well-known, perhaps not the most influential. Another part is to enrich the core, but every school has done this, beyond, you start at a kit of parts and you end up a city over 4 semesters, so don't do that anymore. But really, perhaps most significantly, and about what Yale is known for, the third-year studios taught by incredible architects from around the world. Todd and Billy are sitting right here, and they've taught many times at Yale. It's been fantastic. But to invite people who are not only great architects and great teachers, but who will teach programs that have perhaps greater relevance to today's world. So Frank Gehry is teaching this semester, but he's teaching a studio about the redesign of the American prison. So he's using his celebrity to bring attention to a very difficult issue we have in this country. So that's the change. To the second part of your question, you and I have talked about this. I don't believe it's a zero-sum game. I don't think the schools are in competition with each other. I mean, we might be in some ways, but the better, wiser me knows that the more people educated as architects, whether they become architects or not is a separate conversation, but educated in the way architects think and understand the world, the better it is for the world. So we, Yale, and all the other architecture schools, Cooper Union, for example, we're all on the same team. And that I really do believe.
Schools are indeed different, and you are somehow directly responsible for me sitting here. What do you think I should do with this school?
I think you're doing a pretty good job.
No. What do you think are the opportunities? Because remember, we are primarily an undergraduate program.
Well, that was about where I was.
Landscape has changed, over the years.
That was where I was about to go, which is, I think one of the strengths of Cooper Union is that it is a 5-year program. RISD was a 5-year program when I was there, although they now offer a master's degree as well. I don't know if you guys do or not. But I think programs are enormously valuable, and they're particularly enormously valuable as we look as a profession and as a discipline as to how we can be more diverse. education is expensive, even here now, it turns out. And if you know you want to be an architect, and you can get there in 5 years rather than 7 or 8, and you can go to places that cost less and get to your career faster, that makes it financially possible for more people to consider it as a future. And so I think, separate from what you teach and how you teach it and who your faculty is, which I'm sure you will do superbly, this school, as a 5-year school, I think it plays a very important role.
You know, I haven't mentioned that you're a woman. And it was purposeful.
Good,
But
thank you.
at the same time, I was caught off guard a month and a half ago with my own innocence at the kinds of things that are happening in the world today. Some of it is with women, others have to do with just the advent of power and how it's being wielded in relationship to subordinates, as it were, or people. And I want to know what it has been like, because your work is not measured by gender in any way or form and doesn't need to be. And yet, you're an individual that has emerged against many odds in a practice that has very few women. And I wonder what your thoughts are, more broadly, or specifically in relationship to the exposure of all of the things that we've seen in the media over the past month or two.
I'm smiling with a kind of mournful regret about, not about my life, but about just all the news that we've been hearing. And I'll go back a little bit into your question and say, we as an office, and there are many people from the office here, we have a lot of women in the office, very proud of that, very important to our culture. My husband asked me when the first bit of news came out, the sort of the Harvey Weinstein news came out, and he said, "So did that ever happen to you?" And I looked at him across the dinner table with a kind of, duh. I think it has happened in some way, in some form, to every woman, and whether it's small aggressive acts or unknowing abuses of minor power, it is part of our lives. And perhaps the one happy piece of all this horrible news that's been coming out is women and others, it's not just women, but women and others feel that they can finally say something. And hopefully that will start to bring about change.
So joking aside, it must be good to be the boss of Peter Eisenman.
No comment.
Look, I want to open up the floor to questions. It's been, I think, an absolutely delightful lecture. I am in awe of your work, in great part because of not only its excellence, but the seeming effortlessness of what you do. But you bring such maturity to it, but without the contrivances of the so-called modern masters. The over-deliberate control that is brought to the work of Kahn or Mies, the discipline of all of that is in the work, and yet somehow you've known and probably figured out that there's a certain space of work that needs to be left alone, and you displayed that incredibly well with maybe the struggle of having to deal with historic preservation or the layering of history in these buildings, and knowing when to lay off, basically, right? But I wonder, do you have the compulsion to design to the last instant, and when is enough enough?
I think the answer to that question is no. I don't have the compulsion to. I don't think as an I, and there are a fair number of big we out there, we do this work together. I don't think we collectively have the compulsion. Sometimes some of us do, but we pull back from it. I think there needs to be room to breathe, both metaphorically and actually.
And that is in part where the everyday comes into the work.
That's right.
You allow the everyday to enter into the work.
The work needs to stand free and be recognizable as work that takes a position, that has an idea. But I like it when sometimes in a dusk-like moment, not literally dusk, but in a dusk-like moment, it becomes slightly background and the work within it becomes more foreground and vice versa. I think that's the part of life, that's the everyday.
When I think of the role of a dean, there's always that tension between you as an architect and you as someone who presides over a faculty. And I wonder, who are the deans you look at, and what are the moments that you think are the most important roles that we've seen, either in our lifetime or, come on.
In some ways, I'll say I actually look at deans who aren't architecture deans, and I've made a new set of friends at Yale of the other new women deans, dean of the law school, dean of the forestry school, dean of nursing doesn't seem like such a surprise, but she's an extraordinary woman. A couple of deputy provosts and other senior people, and I think we learn from each other how we can, with this unique position at a kind of cusp. Yale went, I think, from having 2 women deans to having half of all the deans are women in a very, very short period, that we can use that kind of change of climate in the rooms to move our initiatives forward without being emperors or ogres, but as those who collaborate and lead, I hope, by example and inclusion.
But it's a rare occasion that the work of other deans serves as a didactic instrument in the same way that
a building does?
Well, yes. And sometimes there are schools of thought, and they come together by the ways in which not only culture is made, but a very particular culture. Think of IIT, right? And maybe it's radically the opposite of something of Boyarsky's AA, where Boyarsky maybe has the most profound impact on architectural culture of London of that period, but without having even identified an authorship of any sort of his own.
I mean, I think Boyarsky is an interesting example, but in some ways, don't fall over when I say this, I think there is some connection between Boyarsky as an example at the AA with his advanced studios and the diversity of the people who were teaching them and the different positions they held and the different ways they decided to teach. Yeah. And actually what Bob did at Yale, and whatever one thinks of Bob, and God knows he's left me some gifts and some burdens, but I think everybody was worried when he started that Yale was going to be postmodern, sort of overly ornate, work like Bob's work, and he didn't do that at all. He brought in a huge variety of voices, so I do see that connection between, although Boyarsky was a little bit more invisible in how he did it, and Bob was much more front and center on the stage, the multitude of voices, each pursuing a good teacher, an idea that they could convey without making their students be models of them, I think is the right way to run a school. And I think those two schools, I was at the AA for a year when Alvin was running it. I was in Rem's studio, no less.
I didn't know that.
With Zaha, no less. I do think that is a model which I would like to, at Yale, do in a meaningful 21st century way, so that it's not solely about that the expanse isn't by having Leon Krier and Zaha Hadid teach in the same semester, that it's not boiled down solely to style, but actually to the nature of the broader idea itself than just what it looks like.
May I invite questions from the audience? If you could step up to the mic, please.
These lights are blinding.
Yeah.
I grew up in Aalto campus from 1960 to 1972 in Finland, and your work would have been perfectly in balance in that campus. How do you avoid, with all intellectual vigor, you did not show one single flashy computer rendering, but you seem to have taken some material sensibility all the way through, including some of the images that I saw, where you have workshop and people making real models and not. How do you avoid the current fascination with gleaming images and
Well, on a personal level, it's because I'm incapable of doing it. And I think in terms of the spirit and character in our office, we try to investigate ideas in lots of different ways at the same time, and you could see there were different hands, did different drawings, and we're all together trying to figure things out. Different hands made different models. So I don't want to be seduced by the images, because we're not being critical enough of ourselves as we work. And I'll say, autobiographically, a little separate from your question, but about the materials, my mom was a fashion designer, and when I was a kid growing up, she was a professor at FIT, and the basement, she's 95 now, but she still lives in the house I grew up in, and the basement is completely filled, floor to ceiling, on steel shelves with folded yard goods and bolts of fabric. And so I learned as a child, you know, this feels like wool and this feels like silk, and oh, don't buy that, that's a man-made material, and that's a little bit of cotton, and you can feel the nub. They left some of the nubs on the fiber, and that's a twill and a weave. And so every part of my growing up had a kind of very specific materiality to it that had texture, color, and way of being made, and I think that's part of who I am.
Thank you for your presentation. Forgive my nerves, I'm just going to read my question. Going off the fact that you seem to work quite a lot with existing projects, some by your admission dilapidated, and given the fact that part of your legacy will live on in the education of many, I'm curious, how long do you think architecture should live?
I don't know that there's an easy answer for that question. Good architecture forever. Bad architecture, hopefully as short as possible. I think one has to, whatever you think of the buildings, there was a time when courthouses and post offices were built with a kind of vigor and strength. And they were built to be 100-year buildings or 150-year buildings. And now you see post offices and their trailers or butler buildings. So some of how long, I'm not answering architecture, some of how long buildings should last comes, I think, from the intention of the owner, in effect, and what their goals and aspirations for the buildings are. But I think it's good if buildings actually last for a long time and can be changed over time so that they become a record of how we lived, what we thought about, and what we're thinking about now, and who will mark them and change them as the broad we goes forward.
I have a question about finding your voice. So in the world of architecture, you are surrounded by many voices, great architects, famous architects. So my question is that in any kind of projects, how do you find your voice? You know, my friend told me there's kind of like intuition and your gut feeling versus voice. Don't go there, don't do that, don't. So how do you know your path that you truly want to go to, and you know the language of design and all that, to like at the end of the day you will stand in front of the building, you feel, oh, I feel good, I feel great. So I just have a question that.
There's no easy answer to that question. A little bit, you know it internally to yourself when you do it. This is me, this feels right, this is true to who I am. Just as you do maybe when you cook or have dinner with somebody or read a book, you know, what feels right to you, what do you know is right for you. It takes a long time to become a real architect because you have to do it again and again and again and again and again, and buildings are slow and clients are frustrating and nobody ever has enough money. And but I would say to the second part of your sentence, you know, when you stand outside and you say, this is good or this is great, I think it feels really good when you say, this is good. And if you look at your own work and you say, this is great, you're delusional, because, not you personally, but because you want it to be good, but you want to learn from it so that you can try to make the next one great. And it probably shouldn't be great either, but it will be better than the one before it.
Thank you.
Are we done?
That is just a perfect way to end. Thank you so much.